Great. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Hi, everybody. My name is Nathaniel Penrod, and I'm a GIS contractor with the National Park Service. I've been with them for just a little over 2.5 years now. I'm really excited for the opportunity to be with you all today and to discuss some exploratory methods the Park Service has been using to map benthic geomorphology at Isle Royale National Park using a relatively new tool called BRESS. So if some of you were at last year's Lakebed 2030 conference, I was able to speak back then about work we were doing to evaluate different tools to map geomorphology. And today I'm going to basically give an update on what we've done in the past year using this tool to look at different geomorphology classifications for the lakebed. So next slide. So before I get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation here, I want to just quickly give a shout out to several individuals who have been collaborators on this project. So Jay Glaze and Brenda Marasca-LaFrancois from the National Park Service have been kind of the co-principal investigators on the National Park Service's Great Lakes benthic mapping program that started just a little over 10 years ago. So they've been really involved with this project. Also, Jamie Hoover from Front Range Community College. She and I have worked very closely on developing the methods you are going to see here today, and she is giving a presentation immediately following this one. So these two presentations kind of are meant to go together. My presentation is going to focus more on the technical GIS side of our mapping methods, and then Jamie is going to come in and focus more on applications and also the CMECS mapping side of things. So if you're interested in that, definitely stick around for her presentation. It's going to be great. And then also just want to quickly acknowledge the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative for the funding that we've received from them for this project. We're really grateful for that partnership. Next slide. So when we're looking kind of at a broad scale at why you would do any kind of benthic mapping in the Great Lakes, one really key consideration for the National Park Service and why this work got started, or one of the main reasons, was to do habitat mapping. Back in about 2010, there was a general growing consensus among people at the Park Service that we didn't really know that much about the different benthic habitats out at Isle Royale specifically. At Isle Royale, almost 77% of the park's area is submerged underwater. So this created, really a management problem for park staff who really didn't have the information they needed to make well-informed decisions about managing, about policies and management decisions that could impact habitats for important cornerstone species in the park. So two habitat types we're particularly concerned with are fish spawning grounds and then also native and invasive mussel beds. Next slide. So when we're thinking about habitats and what makes up a habitat, we have used the CMECS framework to kind of guide us in terms of our mapping approaches. So within CMECS, you kind of have 4 components that you analyze to determine habitat type for a specific area. So you look at the water column component, a geoform component, a substrate component, and a biotic component. And in this presentation today, I'm going to discuss how we've looked at mapping that geoform component of these different habitats. Specifically for fish spawning sites, we know that the underlying geomorphology is really key to determining where those sites are. For example, we know that some species of lake trout prefer to spawn on ridges that have an underlying coarse unconsolidated substrate. So being able to identify those ridge features from bathymetry data would be really helpful in terms of looking at where those spawning grounds might be, and then looking at different ways to maybe study egg deposition and things like that in the future. So next slide, please. So To be able to do this mapping, back in the late 2000s, the Park Service started doing a lot of data collection. So we were able to get a topobathy LiDAR data set from the United States Army Corps of Engineers for most of the nearshore areas of Isle Royale. That was collected in 2009. And then between 2011 and 2018, the National Park Service conducted a number of multi-beam sonar surveys out at the island, collecting both bathymetry and backscatter. The finest resolution we were able to collect out there was down to about a ½ meter. But once we compiled all the different surveys together, we ended up scaling everything up to a 5-meter resolution. So going forward, the bathymetry you'll see in the presentation today is all at a 5-meter resolution. And then to kind of help us ground truth our habitat classifications, we conducted a number of underwater camera surveys. So between 2010 and 2019, I believe we had just over 1,000 sites where we have gone out to do underwater camera work. And you can see a couple examples there on the right-hand side of the slide of what some of the substrates look like that we've surveyed. Next slide, please. So at Isle Royale National Park, I'm going to focus on 2 study sites today to show you the work we've done mapping geomorphology in these areas. So I'm going to focus on a study site on the outer eastern edge of Siskiwit Bay, and then also a site out on the north shore of the island off of a smaller island called Hawk Island. Next slide, please. So here's what the bathymetry data for those 2 sites look like. So on the left there, you'll see our Siskiwit Bay study site. We're looking at depth ranges there of about 20 to 100 meters beneath the low water datum and an average slope of 4.4 degrees. And on the right-hand side, there's the bathymetry for the Hawk Island area. Over there, we're looking at depth ranges of right at the low water datum to 130 meters beneath it, and an average slope of 9.7 degrees. So it was really key for us when we were thinking about mapping geomorphology to kind of look at an area that was a bit flatter, had a little bit less terrain variation, and then also compare it with an area that was a lot steeper and had a lot more terrain variation. So one thing that really made us interested in mapping the geoform component is, unfortunately, for a lot of our study areas out at Isle Royale, we don't have good backscatter data, whether through due to local conditions at the time of collection or from errors in different settings that were programmed. A lot of the backscatter data really isn't too usable. And then also for a lot of the nearshore areas, we have no backscatter at all. So when we were talking about creating geoform maps for the entire island, we really needed to find a method, one that could be semi-automated because of the large volume of data that we had for Isle Royale. In total, I think we have just about 150 square miles of bathymetry data in different areas around the park. So to analyze that, we needed something that was going to be semi-automated, and then we also needed to find a way to see if that tool could just use the bathymetry data and get around the lack of backscatter. So next slide. So this led us to BRESS, which is short for the Bathymetry and Reflectivity-Based Estimator for Seafloor Segments. This is a really great tool. It's an open source software package. It was originally developed by researchers at NOAA and the University of New Hampshire at the Joint Hydrographic Center over at UNH. It was first published in 2018, and basically what the tool does is it segments bathymetry data into areas of consistent morphological type. And those areas of consistent morphological type are geoforms like flats, ridges, slopes, and valleys. And you can see an example output from BRESS on the right-hand side of your screen there for that Siskiwit study area. So how does BRESS calculate these geoforms? It uses a really unique approach. It uses an adaptive line of sight modeling approach which allows the algorithm to self-scale to different terrain features. So this may be a little technical, but when I show you some more outputs from later on in the presentation, this will all hopefully make sense. But basically what BRESS is doing is it's looking out in 8 different directions from a cell being analyzed using a search annulus with an inner and an outer radius. Within that inner and that outer radius, along each of those 8 directions, which are the cardinal and then ordinal directions around the cell, BRESS calculates the zenith and nadir angles, and then compares those angle measurements to a user-defined parameter called the flatness angle to basically determine what areas around the cell being analyzed are higher, lower, or level with that cell. And it then uses that information to produce a geoform output. So next slide. Thank you. So before I kind of dive into discussing different parameters within BRESS and show you some of our outputs, I wanted to give you first a real quick overview of the general workflow we use within BRESS. So we start out with our bathymetry data as a raster, and then we feed that into BRESS. And the first thing we kind of have to do outside of BRESS is determine our mapping scale, which then drives how we select different parameters and how we optimize them so we can really classify the features of interest in a study area. We then develop a flat geoform mask, which I will talk about in a second. We then create coarse and fine scale geomorphology maps within BRESS. We then export them into ArcGIS and do some analysis to apply a minimum mapping unit to them. And then finally, we combine that coarse and fine scale geomorphology map into a single multi-scale geomorphology map. Next slide. So a brief word here about mapping scale and how the parameters within BRESS are associated with that. So when we were thinking as a team about what kind of scale we wanted to use to map geoforms, we had a lot of questions about what is the most realistic minimum mapping unit, or MMU, that we could achieve. Given that our data has a 5-meter resolution, we were really interested in seeing how fine of a minimum mapping unit can we achieve. However, we were also interested in broader trends in the geomorphology and wanted to be able to pull both of those out. So we decided to adapt different BRESS parameters to look at finer scale features and also coarser scale features, and then compare the 2 outputs. So within BRESS, the 4 parameters you can use to basically control the scale of the features that get mapped are the flatness angle, the outer and inner radius of the search annulus, and the number of geoform classes. So for all of our study areas, we kept the number of geoform classes at 4, just real simple, real straightforward. We didn't want to get too complicated. And now I'll show you examples of what happens when you change those other 3 parameters. So when you look at flatness angles, basically what flatness angle does is as you change it, it determines the threshold at which BRESS will classify morphology as either flat or non-flat. And then if it classifies the morphology surrounding the cell as non-flat, it will then decide whether or not it's a slope, a ridge, or a valley, depending on what class it fits best into. So holding the inner and outer radius constant here, you can basically see that as we increase the flatness angle, you start to get a broader and broader sense of trends in the lakebed, and you also map fewer and fewer features. So next slide. If we look at changing the outer radius for that search annulus, you see a little bit of change. However, we found that changing the outer radius really didn't contribute much to determining the scale of the geoforms as they got mapped. So next slide. So what we were really ended up being interested in was the setting for the inner radius of the search annulus. Again, here you can see a very similar effect to the flatness angle parameter. As you increase the inner radius, again, you get more of a sense of general trends and fewer features. But one cool thing about the inner radius that we realized is effectively the inner radius that you set for the search annulus is going to be your default minimum mapping unit. So for us, that meant, okay, if we select an inner radius of 3 with 5-meter resolution bathymetry data, that means that the smallest feature BRESS is going to identify is going to be no larger than 225 square meters on the lakebed. So that effectively became, or that's effectively how we determined our minimum mapping unit for both the coarse and the fine scale geoforms. Next slide. So before I kind of get into showing you some more BRESS outputs, one final key thing in BRESS that kind of helps you determine the scale of the output is a parameter called the flat mask. So flat mask is a totally optional parameter, but basically what it allows you to do is to account for noise in your data set and apply a slope-based cutoff to the mapping of geoforms. So in our case, we decided that within BRESS, we wanted all features that had a slope of less than 3 degrees to be classified as flats. And then we also looked at maps of the bathymetric position index for our study areas, and then used different thresholds at a fine scale BPI and a coarse scale BPI to determine areas that no matter what, we were really confident were going to be flat. And that allowed us to mask out things like artifacts from sonar data and other things like that that would have otherwise impacted our analysis. Next slide. So here's kind of the general process of how we went about creating our final multi-scale geoform maps and also the parameters we ended up using. So for our coarse scale geoform map, we used a flatness angle of 3, an inner radius of 10 cells, an outer radius of 50 cells with a minimum mapping unit of 2,500 square meters. And then for our fine scale geoforms, we used a flatness angle of 1, an inner radius of 3 cells, an outer radius of 15 cells, and we had a minimum mapping unit of 225 square meters. So with those outputs from BRESS, we went into ArcGIS to apply the different MMUs to the BRESS outputs, basically just to eliminate any geoforms that were smaller than the minimum mapping unit and to kind of clean the data up and get rid of artifacts. After that process was completed, the coarse and fine scale, we combined those two maps into one single raster, went back through and cleaned out any small features that were artifacts from the combination that were smaller than our smallest minimum mapping unit, and ended up with a multi-scale output. Next slide, please. So here's an example of our coarse and fine scale geomorphology outputs for Siskiwit Bay. Again, on the coarse side, you can see just general trends being pulled out. And then in the fine scale output, you can see some really interesting variations within particularly the broader scale or coarser scale flats that we were interested in looking at. Next slide. And then if we move over to Hawk Island using those same parameters, we see a very similar thing. We're getting a really good idea of coarse scale trends in the bathymetry, and also highlighting more of those finer details with the fine scale geomorphology. Next slide. So when we look at these two different scales and we look at the areas that are covered by each of them, one of the really interesting things we see between the two sites is the percentage of flats versus slopes that were mapped at Siskiwit Bay versus Hawk Island, which we would expect given how much steeper and more rugged the bathymetry is over at the Hawk Island study area. One other quick thing that's really interesting to note here is that typically flats and slopes end up being the dominant area or the dominant geomorphology types classified in the Siskiwit Bay area, and slopes and depressions or valleys tend to be the more dominant geoform classifications in the Hawk Island area. So next slide, please. So this is an example of what it looks like when we combine those fine scale and the coarse scale geomorphology maps into one map. And essentially what you're looking at here is a 16 class geomorphology map that shows both the broad and the fine scale features in one go. So the way the legend is set up is that if the geoform at both scales was the same, that class retained that geoform name. And if otherwise, if the geoform class at both scales was not the same, we labeled the fine scale geoform first, with the coarser scale geoform after. So for example, in an area that's labeled as a flat, low relief on ridge, that would be an area that in the finer scale output was classified as a flat, but in the broader scale output was classified as a ridge. Next slide, please. So to kind of better visualize this data and to actually see what kind of features we were seeing on the lakebed, we decided to create different profiles to look at the depth data and then compare how the BRESS output was draped over that to see what kind of features we were picking up on. Next slide. So in Siskiwit Bay, on top you'll see a 3D visualization of that profile line with the BRESS output over the top, and then below is the depth profile. Next slide. And here are some kind of unique features that we were able to identify in the study area. So starting from the left, you can see that finer scale depression out on a flat that shows up both in the depth profile and also in the BRESS classification, followed by a small ridge that rises up out of that depression. To the right of that, you can see this broader flat area that's getting picked up well as the slope area up to this more ridge trough complex to the right of the profile, where you can see different troughs and ridges being identified. Next slide, please. So same thing for Hawk Island, looking at the BRESS output along that profile line as well as the depth profile. Next slide. We can also see some really interesting features being pulled out. Again, BRESS on the whole does a really good job of pulling out generally sloped areas. It also does a really nice job of picking up the tops of ridges. But one thing here that I really want to point out that's interesting from a habitat mapping perspective, and is also why we wanted to do a multi-scale approach, is looking at those two mint green lines or boxes in the middle there, which are essentially slopes on the side of a larger scale ridge. Now those are important or interesting to us from a fisheries perspective because we know that a lot of these ridges from our camera work out there, we know that a lot of the tops of these ridges are bedrock, and these areas on the side of them tend to be the kind of coarse unconsolidated sediment that might make really good fish spawning habitat. So it was really cool to see BRESS pick up on those areas, and we're interested in investigating how we can use that information to look at fish habitat going forward. Next slide, please. So to just kind of wrap up here, we've found throughout this last year of work that there are several advantages to using BRESS to map geomorphology. It's very scalable, the methodology is repeatable, and it's highly adaptable to different kinds of terrain that you would want to look at. It also is an excellent alternative to habitat mapping methods that rely heavily on backscatter, because like I said earlier in the presentation, for us, we just don't have backscatter for a lot of our study areas. So a way to be able to kind of get around that and look at the underlying geomorphology is to use a tool like BRESS, look at different scales, and then merge the two together to get a good idea of the features that are out on the lakebed. Next slide, please. So finally, just kind of some next steps looking forward, where we want to go from here. By no means is this finished. We still have a long way to go. Kind of the main steps we're looking at going forward are we're going to hopefully switch from, or we're looking to shift from more qualitative ways of approaching how we select our BRESS parameters to quantitative ways. So in a lot of cases for this study, we basically just gave it the good old eye test and got a bunch of us around a computer and said, okay, what flatness angles, what radius lengths seem to be capturing features we're interested in. And that's how we determined our final parameters. We think there might be a better way to go about that that's more quantitative, which would help us then apply BRESS at the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore and also at Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, where we also have bathymetry data sets that we want to analyze in this way. A really key component of our work going forward is going to be linking these geomorphology outputs to habitats. Like I pointed out at that last profile there from Hawk Island, seeing if we can verify that those ridge edges being pulled out in the geomorphology output are ecologically relevant for different fish spawning habitats and things like that. And then we're also looking in how do we go from this BRESS output, which really doesn't have much CMECS terminology to it, to translating it into a CMECS classification system that then can be shared with the public and widely distributed and then compared across multiple study sites. So with that, I will wrap up here. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Nathaniel. That was a really interesting presentation. You mentioned Apostle Islands, I think, but to your knowledge, are there other sites in the Great Lakes where BRESS has been applied for mapping geomorphology?
So as far as I know, it's still kind of in a bit of an experimental stage. So to the extent that we've done at Isle Royale, the only other park or place I know of that has worked similar to this is Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, which actually is what Jamie Hoover is going to talk about in the next presentation. And I know some folks over at NOAA have done some experimentation looking at using BRESS for new sonar data that they just collected over in the Apostle Islands area. But beyond that, I have not seen BRESS applied to map geomorphology inside the Great Lakes beyond those 3 sites.